Okay, so today we're jumping into one of the most, truly dramatic chapters in the entire Gospel of Matthew. It's this incredible story of these dizzying spiritual highs and then these shocking, crushing lows, all packed into one narrative that, when you look closely, seems to hide this secret logic about what faith really is. And this really gets us to the core question of this whole chapter, doesn't it? It's a bit jarring. How is it even possible to have this profound mountaintop experience with God, to literally see pure glory, and then, in what feels like the very next breath, just face complete and utter failure? It's a spiritual problem I think a lot of us can relate to. And the answer, well, it's a lot more complex than you might think. So let's break it down, starting right at the peak. So our story kicks off on a high mountain. And in the Bible, that's always a symbol for getting closer to God, right? After telling his disciples that some of them would actually see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, Jesus takes his inner circle, that's Peter, James, and John, and they head on up. And up there, something absolutely extraordinary happens. They call it the Transfiguration. And it wasn't just some miracle, it was a deliberate unveiling. For just a moment, Christ's true divine nature, the part that was usually veiled in his human form, was just allowed to shine through. His face blazed like the sun, his clothes became whiter than light itself. He was giving them a glimpse of the glory that was to come, kind of a sneak peek of the afterlife, to really strengthen them for the tough road ahead. And think about who was there to see this. You've got Moses, the great lawgiver who stands for the entire law, and also for all those who have died in faith. Then you have Elijah, the great prophet, representing all the prophets and everyone who is still living. So what you have here is basically the entire story of Scripture and really all of humanity, both the living and the dead, all brought together to witness this one singular moment of glory. It's huge. And then the climax. A bright cloud, which always symbolizes the divine presence, just envelops them. And a voice, the voice of God the Father, booms from the heavens. This is no metaphor. It's a direct, unmistakable confirmation of who Jesus is and what his authority is. Right now, these disciples are at the absolute peak of any spiritual experience you can imagine. But this incredible mountaintop moment was about to smash headfirst into a shocking reality down in the valley. So as they come down the mountain, the whole scene just shifts, and it shifts hard. That serene, heavenly glory is gone. It's been replaced by chaos, by confusion, and by just plain human weakness down below. And what about the disciples who were left behind? Well, they were confronted with a situation that left them completely and totally powerless. The contrast here is meant to be jarring, almost shocking. They had been given authority. They had been with the source of all power, and yet when a real-world crisis hits, they were just useless. The spiritual whiplash here is just intense. Think about it. Up on the mountain, you have divine glory on full display. Down in the valley, demonic power running wild. On the mountain, the very voice of God is heard. In the valley, the disciples are left speechless and humiliated. A father had brought them his son, who was horribly afflicted by a demonic spirit, and Christ's own disciples couldn't do a single thing about it. So what on earth went wrong? Why did they fail so spectacularly? This brings us to the real diagnosis of the problem, where Jesus explains the true nature of the power they were missing. So when the disciples pull him aside later and ask, "Why couldn't we do it?" his answer is so simple and so direct: because of your little faith. And this is absolutely crucial. It wasn't that their authority was taken away. It's that their connection to that authority, through faith, was weak. Then he gives them that famous analogy of the mustard seed. The smallest of all seeds, yet it's capable of these massive things. But what does he actually mean by moving a mountain? Well, the teachers back then used this exact phrase. A mountain mover was a nickname for a brilliant rabbi, someone who could solve a really difficult problem or explain a complex piece of scripture. So Jesus is using their own slang, their own language, to say that real faith can overcome what seems impossible, whether that's a powerful demon, a sin that's got its hooks in you deep, or really any huge obstacle in our lives. But then he adds this really critical piece of instruction. He says, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. And this tells us something really profound. See, faith isn't some static thing you just have. It needs active spiritual discipline. Prayer, that's our weapon. It's the active line of communication to God's power. And fasting, well, that's the countermove. It detaches us from worldly things and basically takes away the enemy's ammunition, things like our own desires and appetites. But hold on, the lesson isn't over yet. There's an even deeper layer to this whole story. Because having faith to move mountains, well, that's not the full picture if you don't get the central paradox of the whole Christian story, the cross. If you look at the timeline, you just can't avoid it. Before, during, and after this incredible display of glory, the conversation always comes back to one thing: his coming suffering and death. Even at the absolute peak of the Transfiguration, the Gospel of Luke tells us that Moses and Elijah were talking with him about his departure, which was a nice way of saying his death, in Jerusalem. The glory and the cross are not two separate things. They are totally intrinsically linked. So, how did the disciples react when they heard this again? It says they became deeply distressed. They just couldn't wrap their heads around it. They had seen the glory. They had witnessed the power, but they could not connect it to the idea of a Messiah who would suffer and be humiliated. They didn't understand that the path to ultimate glory had to go through the cross. And all of this leads us to the final, and honestly, maybe the most surprising lesson in the whole chapter. It's this odd little story about a temple tax, but it masterfully redefines the entire idea of power and authority through this one act of incredible humility. So when they get to Capernaum, these tax collectors ask Peter if his teacher pays the temple tax. And later, Jesus pulls Peter aside and asks him this really simple question. He says, "Kings tax other people, their subjects, right? Not their own kids. The sons of the king are free. They're exempt." The logic is crystal clear. If the temple is his father's house and he is the son of the king, then he is, by definition, totally free from any obligation to pay that tax. He's establishing his true authority, his true status. He is sovereign. But then, in the very next breath, he says they're going to pay it anyway so that we may not cause offense. And then he provides the money through this almost casual miracle. He tells Peter, a fisherman, to just go do his job, cast a line, and the very first fish he catches will have the exact coin needed for both of them in its mouth. He shows his divine power and his humility in the exact same moment. And this right here, this reveals the final, ultimate lesson: the nature of true sovereignty. See, true power isn't about flexing your rights and demanding what people owe you. It's having the freedom and the authority to willingly lay those rights aside for the good of someone else. It's the logic of the cross, just played out in a simple, everyday moment. So we're left with this really powerful thought. The disciples, they saw the light on the mountain, but their faith just collapsed in the valley because they couldn't connect glory with humility. And that really leaves us with the final question for ourselves. Is our own faith built on chasing powerful feelings in these big mountaintop experiences, or is it grounded in the humble, day-to-day walk of prayer, fasting, and willingly laying down our own rights for the sake of other people?